In chapter 4, Paul will tell us that he is in chains. Scholars and historians believe that this likely meant he was under some kind of house arrest, but he was free to engage in at least some expressions of ministry, including his correspondence with the various churches, which we heard about in the children's time this morning, his letters. Still, he was probably literally chained to a Roman guard. So it was a pretty miserable situation. Now, the reason Paul is being detained by the authorities is not so much because they are offended by his belief that Jesus is the long-promised Savior, but because he won't give his undivided loyalty to the emperor. Paul serves a different Lord who commands him to speak and act differently from what pleases the reigning Caesar. Is the text seeming a little less remote as you think about it? Well, if it is, let's dive into it. There are several themes woven through this long passage, but I want to look at just one in verses 3 through 5. Paul here expresses gratitude to the Colossians for their faith, their love for one another, and their hope in what is to come. The triad is familiar, right? But we usually think of it in a different sequence. And that's from Paul's more famous use of it in 1 Corinthians 13:13. These three remain: faith, hope, and love. Now that's an appealing series of nouns, but there's risk in it, because it can too easily become sloganish, kind of memeing, a pithy colloquialism. And in so doing, it becomes trite, a meaningless filler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the young, brave, brilliant World War II era German pastor, moral theologian, Christian ethicist, and Nazi resistor, wrote about his journey as a Christian from the phraseological to the real. So let's go from the pithy, trite bumper sticker to the deep and meaningful dicta. What about these virtuous pillars of faith, love, and hope? And how do they relate to the time we are living in? To answer that, I think we need to veer away from Paul and go to the ultimate authority for the Christian, at least in my estimation, and that is to Jesus. I believe the only way to properly understand Paul is to look at him through the hermeneutical lens of Jesus. Now, hermeneutical, you might ask? The hermeneutical. Hermeneutics refers to the science of interpretation. And we all employ hermeneutical rules, habits, methods, biases for interpreting the meaning of things. The one I think is apropos here is what I call the Hebrews 1 and 2 rule. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Now, the last days refers to, in theological speak, the eschaton, the end times. Some see it in a kind of cartoonish future. Others as simply the epoch that followed the arrival of God in the flesh, the incarnation of Bethlehem, and will last until Christ's second coming. So it's the time of Jesus, if you will. And as I see him, Jesus not only has the last word on everything, he is, in fact, the very word on everything. That's the John 1:1 rule. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Am I sounding like one of those other preachers who have the formula, the rule for this and that, and the list of 3 things, and ye, yeah, I hope not. But anyway, I would love to explore what Jesus says and does about all 3 of these virtues, but there simply isn't time to do it this morning, so I'm going to go right to the most important one, and we've already heard beautifully about it today. Again, Paul commends the Colossians for the faith and love that spring from the hope stored up for you in heaven, and about which you have already heard. I like this translation. I think this is NIV that I poached from. I don't know what we were using this morning. Is that ESV?
It's the NRSV.
NRSV. So, both have a nice stereo-optical view of this, but in the NIV, it's rendered the true message of the gospel. And that seems particularly meaningful in the present moment. Paul seems to suggest here that the hope of the gospel generates love in those who know it and experience it. When asked what was the most important thing God ever commanded, you recall, Jesus positioned love as the supreme virtue. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these, says Jesus. Now, love, agape in the Greek New Testament, ahava, the Hebrew from the Old Testament, both have their roots in giving of itself, to give. So this giving love, and I use that as giving dash love, is at the core of the Christian message and must always be the primary motivator for Christians. Love is the way we are to engage with the other. In fact, Jesus says, love is the singular characteristic that identifies a Christian, a follower of Christ. The attribute of love is the only way anyone will ever know we are connected to Jesus as Christ followers, as Christians. By this, everyone will know you are my disciples, says Jesus, if you love one another. I've discovered that loving actions towards others and not religiosity are what Jesus honored most. The bottom line is that faith, trust or confidence in God and good, hope, the assurance that God and good will prevail in the end. And love, the modus operandi, the modus vivendi of the now and present, represent the essence of Jesus' teaching, with love being paramount. As Paul wrote about a decade earlier in that last clause of 1 Corinthians 13:13, the greatest of these is love. So how can love help us meet the moment we are in? When Jesus commanded us to love your neighbor as yourself, that's Mark 12, he didn't include ranking the subjects or objects of our love. What's so radical about Jesus is his model message and ministry. In it, there is no advancing an order to whom we are to love. No gradations, no concentric circles, no in and out lists, no acceptable and unacceptable classifications. Jesus' example of embracing the marginalized, touching the lepers, dignifying the Samaritans, defending the condemned woman, provide our blueprint for treating all people equally, for welcoming the stranger, for showing immigrants compassion and empathy rather than contempt and cruelty, including all and not excluding some. Paul will echo this in a couple of chapters on, when he says here, there is no Gentile or Jew, but Christ is all and is in all. This demolishes prejudice or preference based on race and gender, class, or sexual identity. It demands we see the inherent equality and dignity, indeed the divine image, in every human face. Now, faith compels us to believe that transformation is possible, even in a highly polarized society. Hope insists that circumstances can change through persistent action. And love requires concrete sacrifice, concrete action on behalf of the other. Love requires we give ourselves to and for the other. And that flies in the face of the zeitgeist. Dare I quote again my dear Dietrich? He called Jesus the consummate one for others. The bottom line is that these virtues, faith, love, and hope, aren't spiritual abstractions, but real life, revolutionary forces that demand we do what we'll read in a few weeks, when Paul will tell us in chapter 3, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, and humility. It compels us to stand against the politicization of faith, the demonization of others, the poison of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and every form of contempt and dismissal of the other. Some years ago, I was in the Capitol for an early Martin Luther King Jr. Day series of events, and I saw a lot of commotion in the rotunda. And I went in, and I caught the eye of then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She knew me back then as a would-be nemesis, squarely and regrettably on the right. I had even confronted her a couple of times in ugly ways. Still, she swept over to me, took me by the hand, and led me right up to MLK Jr., who crushed my fragile little hand in his massive grip. And then she slung me around to Congressman John Lewis. And she said to him, "John, this is Reverend Chang, who's on the other side of everything. And I think he needs a hug." And John Lewis folded me into his embrace. And he said, "Okay, well, we forgive you today. Maybe not tomorrow, but today. God bless you." Now that may not work for everybody, but that day planted 3 seeds in my heart that others would later water and to which God would give the increase. Love is a powerfully transformative agent. Hebrews 10:24. "And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds." Dare I add good trouble, as we heard this morning. Faith, love, and hope. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these 3 is love. You got it.